Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Shaylee stood in the bridal suite, adjusting her veil with trembling fingers while her best friend, Nora, tried her best to keep her calm. The ceremony should have started 20 minutes ago. He loves you, Shay. He's probably just running late because he wants everything to be perfect, Nora said gently, though her uncertain tone betrayed her concern. But Shaylee knew something was wrong. Mark wasn't the kind of man who arrived late. He was meticulous, dependable, always on time. She glanced at the ornate clock above the vanity, feeling her chest tighten. Every passing second dragged like an eternity. Then the door creaked open. A solemn-looking priest stepped inside. Shaylee immediately knew. "I'm sorry, Miss Shaylee," he began softly. "We've just received word that Mark won't be coming." The word struck like a lightning bolt. Her knees buckled and she grasped the edge of the table for balance. Her veil slipped slightly as tears welled in her eyes, smearing her makeup. "No. There has to be a mistake," she whispered, barely able to speak. But no one answered. She didn't wait for one. Without thinking, Shaylee gathered her dress and bolted from the room, running through the church aisle with curious and pitiful stares trailing her. Her chest ached, not from the effort, but from the humiliation and heartbreak. Outside, in the church parking lot, she paused, desperately scanning for Mark. He wasn't there. Shaylee looked up at the overcast sky, trying to steady her breathing, but the pain surged like a storm inside her. Her thoughts spun wildly. Why? What did I do wrong? Then a memory surfaced 2 weeks earlier. Mark had held her hand while they sat quietly on her couch. His gaze was distant. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he had asked, breaking the silence. "Of course I do," she'd replied, puzzled. "We love each other, don't we?" Mark had hesitated, then smiled. A small, fragile smile. One Shaylee didn't recognize then as a silent warning. Back in the present, she sat on the curb. Her white dress fanned around her like a broken dream. Tears slid down her cheeks in silence. Across the street, hidden inside a black car, Mark watched her. He clutched his phone but didn't move. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "This marriage isn't right for you, Mark. Think about your career, your future." Guilt tightened his chest. He knew what he had done was unforgivable, but he hadn't had the courage to confront Shaylee, or the pressure that had swallowed him whole. Meanwhile, Shaylee wiped her tears and made a silent vow. She wouldn't let anyone see her as weak. She would leave. No calls. No explanations. No goodbyes. The next morning, Shaylee packed a single suitcase and boarded a bus out of Fairmont. Destination: anywhere but here. The first months away were brutal. Shaylee found herself in Maple Ridge, a quiet town 2 hours from Fairmont. She rented a tiny room above a bookstore and got a job as a waitress at a cozy local cafe called Willow and Brew. Every day felt like a battle against sadness, against loneliness, against the crushing sense of failure. Still, she pushed forward. Then, one cold autumn evening, she noticed something unusual: morning sickness, exhaustion, and a constant uneasy feeling. At first, she blamed stress. But one night, her doubts took over. She stopped by the pharmacy after work. In the cramped bathroom of her rented room, she stared down at the pregnancy test in silence. Positive. Her heart pounded. Panic mixed with something unexpected: hope. Could she really raise a child alone? She had no plan, no support, no one to turn to. But as the truth settled in, a quiet determination replaced her fear. This baby was her second chance. She scheduled a visit at Riverside Medical Center, trying to prepare herself mentally. But what the doctor said next left her speechless. "Congratulations, Shaylee. You're having 4. She blinked in disbelief. "4, as in quadruplets?" The doctor nodded with a reassuring smile. "Yes. You're going to be a mother of 4. Her world tilted. Shaylee left the hospital in a daze. The idea of raising one child had been overwhelming. Now she had to prepare for 4. "Can I really do this?" she whispered to herself while walking back to her apartment. But the echo of the doctor's words stayed with her. Mothers always find a way. She poured herself into work. Every tip, every dollar was saved. She moved out of her tiny room and rented a modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of Maple Ridge. It wasn't fancy, but it had a small backyard and space for her future children. At Willow and Brew, regulars began to notice her growing belly. Despite the exhaustion, Shaylee worked long hours, never complaining. Between shifts and prenatal appointments, she cleaned, painted the nursery, and sewed little name tags on second-hand baby clothes. There were dark nights when she cried silently, hugging her pillow. But there were also moments of fierce pride. She never once called Mark. He had made his choice. And now she had made hers. The delivery at Riverside Medical Center was long and complicated, but when it was over, Shaylee held 4 tiny boys in her arms, each one perfect. Lucas, Noah, Liam, Oliver. For the first time since her wedding day, Shaylee felt something she thought she had lost forever. Love? 5 years passed in a blur of diapers, laughter, and sleepless nights. Shaylee, now 33, had built a life around her sons. Their once quiet little house now echoed with shouting, singing, and the sound of toys crashing into walls. Each of the boys had a unique spirit. Lucas was endlessly curious, always asking why. Noah was sensitive and artistic, often found with a crayon in hand. Liam was the class clown, turning everything into a joke. Oliver was the natural leader, organizing his brothers into wild missions. Shaylee worked 2 part-time jobs, Willow and Brew in the mornings and helping at a nearby bookstore in the afternoons. She had no family nearby, but the town had become her support system. Everyone knew the kind, hard-working single mom with quadruplets. Still, there were difficult days. Bills stacked up. The boys outgrew clothes faster than she could keep up. She often wondered if Mark knew, would he care? But she pushed the thought away every time. The boys were her world now. And that was enough. Until one sunny afternoon changed everything. They were at Maple Ridge Park, the boys racing to the swings, when she saw him, Mark. He was sitting on a bench talking to someone, but the moment their eyes met, he froze. Then he looked at the children. The resemblance was unmistakable. Shaylee stood frozen. The air around her seemed to still, the noise of the park fading into a distant hum. Mark was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. She saw his gaze shift from her face to the boys chasing each other in the grass. The shock in his eyes was unmistakable. He knows, she thought. He sees it. Panic surged through her. She had to leave now. Grabbing her tote bag, she called out, Lucas, Noah, Liam, Oliver, it's time to go. Her voice cracked slightly, but she tried to sound firm. The boys groaned in unison, not ready to leave. Just 5 more minutes. Liam protested. Now please, Shaylee insisted. As they began to collect their toys, a familiar voice cut through the noise behind her. Shaylee. She turned slowly. Mark stood there, closer than she thought, with an expression of confusion, shock, and something else. Regret. Mark, she said, her voice flat. He looked past her again, toward the boys. Are they yours? He asked, though the answer was clear. Yes, she replied, her voice steady now. They're my children. Mark's brows drew together. How old are they? 5. It was all he needed to hear. His mouth opened, then closed. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. They're mine, aren't they? Shaylee didn't flinch. Yes, Mark. They're yours. The silence between them was sharp and unbearable. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a habit she remembered well. The boys, sensing something, stood nearby watching, still and quiet for once. Why didn't you tell me? Mark asked, his voice raw. Why didn't you reach out? Shaylee crossed her arms tightly. You left me, Mark. No explanation. No apology. You disappeared the day of our wedding. I was humiliated. Alone. Pregnant. Mark looked away, ashamed. I wasn't ready, he admitted quietly. My mother, she said the marriage would ruin everything. She said it would be a mistake. You think that makes it okay? Shaylee's voice rose, but she caught herself. Do you know what it's like to raise 4 children alone? To go to sleep not knowing if you'll afford rent or diapers. Don't talk to me about mistakes. Mark didn't argue. I want to meet them. Shaylee stepped protectively between him and the boys. It's not that simple. They don't know you. You're a stranger. I'm their father, he said. Shaylee let out a bitter laugh. You don't get to call yourself that. A father is there. A father doesn't run away. Just then, Lucas, the most inquisitive of the 4, tugged on Shaylee's dress. Mommy, who is this man? He asked. Before Shaylee could answer, Mark knelt beside him. Hi there, champ. My name is Mark. Lucas tilted his head. Do you know my mommy? Mark gave a soft smile. Yeah, I knew her a long time ago. Shaylee gently placed her hand on Lucas's shoulder. Go play with your brothers, sweetheart. Mommy will be right there. Lucas hesitated but obeyed. Shaylee turned back to Mark, voice low and firm. You can't just show up and expect to be forgiven. That's not how this works. I'm not leaving this time, Shay, he said, eyes locked on hers. Not again. The next few days were a blur of emotion. Shaylee tried to keep her routine intact, but her mind kept returning to Mark's words, I'm not leaving this time. She didn't believe him. Not yet. Then came a knock at the door. She opened it and froze. Mark stood there, looking more determined than before. "Shaylee, we need to talk," he said. "We've already talked," she replied coldly, blocking the doorway with her body. "I'm not leaving until we finish," he added. Before she could respond, Lucas peeked out from the hallway. "Mommy, it's the man from the park." Shaylee tried to smile at him, but Mark stepped forward, kneeling again. "Hey, buddy. I'm Mark." Lucas stared curiously, but Shaylee intervened quickly. "Lucas, go back to your room. I'll be there soon." Once the boy disappeared, her tone hardened. "You don't get to walk in here and start talking to them. You had 5 years. They're my sons," he snapped, his voice tight. She raised her chin. "And I raised them alone. You think showing up now gives you the right to claim them? I'm not trying to erase what you've done," he said, taking a step closer. "But I want to be in their lives. Is that so wrong?" "You're too late." A long pause. "If you don't let me see them, I'll take it to court," Mark said at last. The words hit Shaylee like a punch to the chest. Her heart thundered. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You'd really do that?" she whispered. "After everything?" "I don't want to, but I will." Mark turned and walked away. Shaylee stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling. She knew then this wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 days later, the envelope arrived. Thick, stamped, and far too official. Shaylee sat at her kitchen table, staring at the document as if it might catch fire. Mark had filed for joint custody. Her chest tightened. He really did it. Desperate, she picked up the phone and called the one person she trusted most, Tessa Morgan, her longtime friend and a skilled family attorney. An hour later, Tessa arrived dressed in a navy blazer, dropping her briefcase beside a chair. "Let me see it," she said. They reviewed the summons together while Shaylee clutched a chipped coffee mug with trembling hands. "He has money, resources, and a legal team," Shaylee said, her voice hollow. "What do I have?" Tessa looked her in the eye. "You have 5 years of sacrifice. Of love. Of showing up every single day. We're going to fight this with everything we've got." Shaylee nodded slowly. "We'll start building your case immediately," Tessa continued. "You'll need character witnesses, documentation of your role as the primary caregiver, financial records, and anything that shows you've given those boys a stable life." "I've kept everything," Shaylee whispered. "Every doctor's note. Every preschool form. Every rent receipt." "Good," Tessa said. "You're stronger than you think." When the initial court hearing arrived at Fairmont County Court, Shaylee entered the courthouse with her heart in her throat. Across the aisle, Mark stood with his attorney, and beside him, to her fury, stood a tall, composed woman with glossy waves and piercing eyes. Sabrina Lennox, his fiancée. The sight of her made Shaylee's blood boil. Mark's lawyer began the argument by praising his financial stability, the upgraded future he could offer the boys, private school, health care, a safe home. It all sounded polished and rehearsed. Then it was Tessa's turn. "Your Honor," she began confidently, "my client has devoted herself entirely to her children. She's the reason they are happy, healthy, and thriving. Mr. Cole may have means, but Ms. Green has love, history, and presence. Those cannot be bought." The judge listened intently. After the hearing, he ordered an investigation. A court-appointed social worker would visit both homes to evaluate the living environments. As Shaylee walked out of the courtroom, her body numb, Mark caught up to her. "I'm not trying to take them from you," he said. "I just want to be their dad." She turned to face him. "You don't file a lawsuit against someone you want to peacefully co-parent with." Behind him, Sabrina rested a manicured hand on his shoulder. "We're just trying to do what's best for the boys." Shaylee's eyes narrowed. "Don't pretend to care. You weren't there when they were sick, or scared, or hungry." She walked away without looking back, her jaw clenched, her fists tight. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was war. The days after the hearing were tense, but Shaylee stayed focused, working, gathering evidence, preparing her home for the social worker's visit. But then things took a darker turn. Whispers began at the boys' school. Other parents gave her tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. One afternoon, the principal pulled her aside. "Ms. Green, I just wanted to check in. We've heard some concerns about your home environment. Nothing formal, but rumors." Shaylee's stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask where they came from. Sabrina. A week later, a local online magazine published an article titled, "Father Returns to Save Quadruplets from Neglect?" The piece portrayed Mark as a devoted father trying to reconnect with his sons, while Shaylee was painted as unstable, overworked, and unwilling to share parental responsibilities. Tessa slammed her phone on the table. She's behind this. Sabrina's spinning this in the media to ruin your image. She's everywhere, Shaylee muttered. School events, teacher meetings, smiling like she belongs. And she's planting stories, Tessa added grimly. This isn't just about custody, it's about power. Shaylee felt the walls closing in. Then came the visit from the court-appointed social worker. She cleaned every corner of the house, set up the boys' drawings, prepped snacks. During the interview, the boys glowed as they spoke about their favorite cartoons, their bedtime songs, and how mommy makes pancakes on Sundays. The social worker seemed genuinely impressed. But she also had to visit Mark's upscale condo downtown. When she did, everything was spotless, designed to perfection by Sabrina. The boys' room had brand new toys, untouched books, and a giant chalkboard wall with their names written in cursive. Still, the worker noticed the way Sabrina answered most of the questions and how rehearsed it all felt. Her report wasn't final, but Shaylee sensed something. The truth was starting to surface. The final custody hearing loomed. Shaylee barely slept the night before. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of her sons in the next room. When morning came, she dressed carefully in a pale blue dress, something soft but strong. Tessa met her at the courthouse steps. Ready? No, Shaylee replied truthfully. But I'll go anyway. Inside Fairmont County Court, the tension was thick. Mark sat beside Sabrina and his lawyer. He looked nervous, tugging at the cuff of his shirt. Sabrina, in contrast, wore a sharp cream-colored suit and a smile that screamed confidence. The judge entered. After a few procedural formalities, both lawyers were invited to deliver their closing statements. Tessa spoke first. Her words were crisp and heartfelt. My client is not perfect, but she is present. She is consistent. She is their home. Then Mark's lawyer countered with a carefully structured argument about financial stability, educational opportunities, and the importance of a father figure. Then came the testimony. First, Mark. Tessa stood to question him. Mr. Cole, can you explain why you left Ms. Green at the altar? Mark hesitated. The room held its breath. My mother told me marrying Shaylee would ruin my future. She said I was making a mistake. And you listened? He nodded. I didn't have the strength to stand up to her. Tessa let that sink in. So your absence wasn't just a decision. It was manipulation. Mark swallowed hard. Yes. But the choice was still mine. Tessa turned slightly. Was Sabrina involved in that decision? Mark glanced at Sabrina. She didn't move. No, he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Then, as if perfectly timed, Tessa stood. Your Honor, I'd like to call a surprise witness. The doors opened. Margot Keller, former housekeeper for the Cole family, stepped in slowly, supported by a cane. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Mark looked stunned. Sabrina's smile vanished. Margot took the stand, her voice soft but clear. Mark's mother told me personally she would never allow her son to marry someone like Shaylee. She called her a liability. Said she'd cut Mark off if he went through with it. Murmurs spread. And Sabrina? Tessa asked. Margot nodded. She was close with Mark's mother. They whispered a lot. I overheard her say once, You're doing the right thing, Mark. Don't let her ruin everything. The courtroom erupted. Lies! Sabrina shouted, standing abruptly. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Mark turned to Sabrina, eyes wide. You knew. She looked away. The damage was done. After the dramatic testimony, the judge called for a recess. Shaylee stepped out into the hallway, her legs shaking beneath her. Tessa handed her a bottle of water, her eyes filled with quiet fire. You did great, she said. That witness changed everything. Across the hall, Mark stood frozen. Sabrina tried to whisper something to him, but he pulled away. She manipulated me, he murmured. All this time, Shaylee didn't look back. She didn't need to. The following week brought new energy. The social worker submitted her final report. While both households were deemed safe, the report strongly emphasized the emotional bond and nurturing stability that Shaylee had built over the past 5 years. Sabrina, meanwhile, vanished from the picture. No more appearances at school. No more smug smiles at hearings. Mark never spoke of her again. Instead, he began to really focus on his sons. He showed up on time for supervised visits. He brought coloring books for Noah, science kits for Lucas, soccer cleats for Liam, and a mini telescope for Oliver. He sat on the floor and built castles. He helped Liam with a splinter. He carried Noah to the car when he fell asleep in Shaylee's arms. First, she watched him like a hawk, waiting for him to disappear again. But week after week, he stayed. One quiet afternoon, while the boys played in the backyard, Mark offered to help with dinner. Shaylee raised an eyebrow. "You know where the knives are?" "Absolutely not," he said with a crooked grin. "But I'm willing to learn." He chopped vegetables with awkward precision while she stirred soup. "I never thought we'd be here," he said softly. "Neither did I," she replied, not looking up. But something in her voice had changed. Less anger, more uncertainty, maybe even forgiveness? With each passing week, Mark's presence became a part of their lives, not as a disruption, but as a rhythm. He picked the boys up from school twice a week, helped with homework, sat in the front row during school plays, and clapped louder than anyone. The boys began opening up to him in ways Shaylee never expected. Lucas was the first to call him Dad. It slipped out during a game of tag. Mark froze, stunned, but instead of making a scene, he smiled and kept playing. After that, the others followed. Noah showed him his newest drawings. Liam made up jokes just to make Mark laugh. Oliver quietly started imitating the way Mark tied his shoes. One evening, Mark brought over an old photo album. He sat on the floor with the boys as they flipped through pictures of his childhood, building forts, camping trips, silly faces. Shaylee stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching in silence. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Mark lingered in the kitchen. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, "for letting me in even a little. I know I haven't earned it." Shaylee looked at him, searching his face. Gone was the polished man she had once planned to marry. In his place stood someone a little softer, a little humbler. "You're trying," she admitted quietly. "They see it. And so do I." A few days later, he surprised them with a project. He brought wood, nails, paint, and a plan to build a small playhouse in the backyard. The boys were ecstatic. For an entire weekend, the yard was filled with hammering, giggles, and chaos. Shaylee watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself. It wasn't just about a playhouse. It was about rebuilding something she never thought possible. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in soft golds and purples, Shaylee stood on the back porch, sipping tea. Mark joined her in silence, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. The newly built playhouse sat proudly in the yard, still smelling of fresh paint. The boys were inside, fast asleep after hours of building, laughing, and negotiating who gets which window. Mark leaned against the railing beside her. For a moment, they just stood there, listening to the breeze. Then he broke the silence. "There's something I need to tell you, Shaylee, about that day at the church." Her shoulders stiffened. She didn't look at him. "I don't need excuses." "It's not an excuse," he said quietly. "It's the truth. And you deserve it." She said nothing but didn't stop him. "My mother didn't just tell me not to marry you. She threatened to cut me off. Said if I went through with it, she'd pull every financial string I relied on. I would have lost everything, my job, my apartment, the startup funding. Everything." Shaylee turned to face him, eyes sharp. "So you left me because of money?" "No," he said quickly. "Because I was a coward. I was afraid. I told myself I was protecting you from a miserable future. But really, I was protecting myself." Her chest rose and fell with slow, deep breaths. "You could have told me," she said. "We could have figured it out together." "I know," he whispered. "And I hate myself for not doing that. For abandoning you and them." Silence stretched between them again. Then, softly, Shaylee replied, "That day broke me. But these boys, they saved me." Mark nodded. "And now they're saving me." The final day of the custody trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled, every whisper stilled as Judge Randall entered. Shaylee sat beside Tessa, her hands clasped so tightly they ached. Across the room, Mark sat alone. No lawyer this time. No Sabrina. Sabrina's absence was glaring. She hadn't appeared in weeks, not since Margot's testimony. Tessa leaned over. "She's gone. Probably knew the damage was done." Mark looked different today, composed, resolved, but not smug. Just present. The judge began reading his decision. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the court finds that the primary custodial arrangement will remain with Ms. Shaylee Green. Mr. Mark Cole is granted scheduled visitation rights and joint legal decision-making authority. Shaylee exhaled, slow and deep. The judge continued. Both parents are expected to cooperate respectfully and prioritize the emotional stability and well-being of the children. It was over. Not a win. Not a loss. Just a step forward. As people filtered out of the courtroom, Mark approached Shaylee. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not shutting me out completely." She nodded, exhausted but steady. "This is for them. It always has been." Just as they were leaving, Sabrina appeared in the hallway. Her face was unreadable. "Do you really think you can play dad now?" she said coldly. Mark met her gaze without blinking. "I don't have to play anything. I am their dad." Sabrina let out a dry laugh. "You're on your own now, Mark. You'll regret it." He stepped back. "I already regret what I did. That's why I won't let myself make the same mistake twice." Sabrina turned sharply and walked away, for good this time. Later that day, Mark stopped by Shaylee's house. The boys ran to greet him, arms wide, smiles huge. Shaylee stood in the kitchen, quiet, watching them laugh. When the boys disappeared to their room, Mark approached. "There's something else I need to say," he said, voice low. Shaylee folded her arms, wary. "What is it now?" "I still love you," he said plainly. "I never stopped. I know that may be too little, too late, but you deserved to hear it." She stared at him, stunned. "Mark, I'm not asking you for anything," he added quickly. "I just needed you to know. And if someday there's even a small chance we can try again, I'll be here." He kissed her forehead gently and left, the sound of the boys' laughter echoing behind him. Shaylee stood still, her heart suddenly heavier and lighter at the same time. Months passed since the final court decision. The new rhythm of life settled in like a gentle tide. Mark was now a regular part of the boys' world. He helped with science projects, coached Little League, and even learned how to braid yarn for Noah's craft days. But something else had shifted too. His relationship with Shaylee, once distant and brittle, began to soften. It started with small things: shared coffee, silent cleanup after dinner, inside jokes when the boys made a mess. Then came weekend lunches, movie nights, long walks after school pickups. There was no declaration, no grand plan, just a slow rebuilding. One sunny afternoon in early spring, Mark invited Shaylee and the boys on a picnic just outside Fairmont, near a field bursting with wildflowers. The sky was clear, the breeze warm, and the boys were wild with joy, chasing butterflies and playing tag. "Come walk with me," Mark said, taking Shaylee's hand gently. She hesitated, then followed. They strolled to a quiet corner of the field where the trees opened to a view of rolling hills. Mark turned to face her, eyes sincere. "You taught me what real love is, Shaylee. Not just for you, but for our children. I was lost back then, and you gave me something to come back to." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I want the second chance to last forever. Will you marry me?" Inside the box sat a simple gold band, understated and timeless, just like her. Shaylee felt her breath catch. For a moment, all the pain, the trials, the past, flickered through her mind like a reel. Then she smiled. "Yes, Mark, I will." From across the field, the boys noticed and ran toward them. Lucas shouted, "Mommy, are you marrying Daddy?" She laughed, kneeling down to hug them. "Yes, my loves, we're going to be a real family." The months that followed were filled with joyful chaos. The wedding took place in a garden surrounded by friends and neighbors who had supported Shaylee through everything. Lucas carried the rings. Noah scattered petals. Liam gave a speech that made everyone laugh, and Oliver walked Shaylee down the aisle with proud little steps. When Shaylee and Mark exchanged vows, it wasn't just a union. It was a promise forged in resilience, sacrifice, and healing. That night, as they danced beneath strings of lights, Mark whispered, "I'll spend every day proving you were right to say yes." And Shaylee replied with a smile, "We're together now. That's all that matters." Later, before bedtime, the boys surprised them with a gift, a handmade photo album filled with stick figure drawings of their family. On the last page, written in big, uneven letters, "Our family is forever."